So the relationship is very bad. I think Donald Trump has every right to be frustrated at Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau's politics have brought about problems for the United States.
Can you tell us a bit about the immigration crisis in Canada today?
Absolutely. So what is important to know is that Canada's immigration rate has increased by 300% just over the past 3 years. And what that looks like on a population basis is quite remarkable. So just this year alone, it looks as though Canada is going to be accepting upwards of 482,000 to 500,000 permanent residents. But that doesn't tell the story, Stephen. What's important to know is that Canada right now has close to 4.9 million temporary residents with expiring visas in the next year. So the expectation from the government is somehow that these 4.9 million people are all going to leave voluntarily and not try to stay and not try to game the system and eventually become residents in this country, either legally or illegally. And there are a bunch of different issues that have resulted from this open border system that has been forced onto us by Justin Trudeau and his government, and we can get into those later on. But the numbers are truly astonishing. Canada already had the largest immigration rate, one of the largest immigration rates in the world. Justin Trudeau has pushed that up to 10 and has basically taken us on an experiment, a mass immigration experiment, which has had disastrous consequences for our country.
Okay, before we get into all of that, I want to start by talking about Donald Trump, because he's been in the news recently. He met with Justin Trudeau at Mar-a-Lago, and there are reports that he essentially threatened Trudeau, jokingly saying he was going to make Canada the 51st state, saying that, and he's also said, publicly that he would impose, I think, 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods unless they control the border with the United States. What do you make of this spat between Donald Trump and Trudeau?
Well, it's not surprising, and I think that it was inevitable because of the way Justin Trudeau has handled the border. The fact is that we never used to have these issues in our country. We never used to have a surge of terrorists from Canada entering the United States until very recently, really until Justin Trudeau came to power. And I think it should be known that there were tariffs that were going to come because Donald Trump levied tariffs on steel and aluminum on Canada in his first term. Did we expect 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports into the U.S.? I don't think anyone was expecting that. And I also don't think anyone was expecting Canada to be given the same punishment as Mexico for fentanyl and terrorism crossing the U.S. border. I want to just highlight for your audience the differences between Canada and Mexico on this, and maybe for some of the Americans paying attention. When it comes to fentanyl, for example, the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol confiscated 43 pounds of fentanyl coming from Canada into the United States. Meanwhile, on average, every single day, the U.S. CBP reports that they are confiscating 78 pounds of fentanyl. So you can do the math and figure out where that is coming from. Now, the situation is different when it comes to terrorists crossing into the United States. A terrorist, according to Tom Homan, Donald Trump's incoming border czar, is 10 times more likely to cross into the United States from Canada than from Mexico. And over the past 3 years, that number has been about 1,100. And since 2022, the bulk of the terrorists that have been encountered at ports of entry from Canada entering the United States has far exceeded the number from Mexico. So the situation is serious. We've brought a lot of this onto ourselves, but 25% tariffs on Canada would destroy our economy. It would tariff our country to death, and that is a serious problem for us. And I think that it's counterproductive for the United States because of the amount of oil that the United States gets from our country.
Can you tell us about how Trudeau views Trump, how he's dealt with Trump during his premiership, and whether he sort of enraged Trump a bit or poked him?
I absolutely think he has. There were some funny videos that emerged. I would call them funny, but I guess they're a bit more serious than that, of Justin Trudeau taking shots at Donald Trump during his first term as president. And Donald Trump returned by describing him as two-faced and really getting angry at Canada in his first term for our failure to commit to 2% of defense spending. Our defense spending is very low, and Donald Trump took his frustration out on our country for not carrying our weight when it comes to defense. But now, since Donald Trump was out of office, Justin Trudeau has been using Donald Trump's politics as an attack against conservatives in Canada, describing the conservative opposition as MAGA Republicans. So Justin Trudeau does not see Donald Trump, and I don't think he predicted Donald Trump to win again. He uses Trump and his brand as an attack. So the relationship is very bad. And furthermore, the deputy prime minister of our country, Chrystia Freeland, when Donald Trump was president, described him as a tyrant. So the relationship is really in a bad way. I think Donald Trump has every right to be frustrated at Justin Trudeau. And Justin Trudeau's politics have brought about problems for the United States. So the situation is bad. I think that he is hoping that Pierre Poilievre, the conservative leader, will take over and will be the prime minister to renegotiate the USMCA. And I think that he's just expecting Justin Trudeau to leave. Maybe these tariffs will hasten his departure.
Just very briefly, can you react to this Trump comment that he said he's going to invade Canada, make it the 51st state? The fact that lots of conservatives online, MAGA supporters, are supporting this liberation of Canada. I know that obviously it's sort of steeped in irony, but what do you make of this MAGA supporting the invasion of Canada?
I mean, I think it is a joke. I think it is a joke for many people, but I don't think I think that it is a joke that is growing in seriousness. I genuinely believe that because I've spoken to a lot of people involved in the Republican movement in the United States, involved at a pretty serious level with the Republican Party, and they're pretty serious about this idea of wanting to have Canada because of our resources and all of that. And so, I think that Canadians would be very wise to remember why our country exists in the first place, and the founding of our country, and the initiatives that were undertaken by the founders of this country to avoid and resist the continental pressures of the United States. We love the United States, but I think that we should be, weary about even joking about this idea. It's funny to think about, but in practical terms, it's not something I think the majority of Canadians want. I will say, however, the economic situation in our country is very bad. And people are desperate for answers and desperate for solutions. And they look at the United States and say, you know what, maybe it would be better because right now, the way we're being treated by our government is terrible. Just for an example, Canada's GDP per capita has declined 6 consecutive quarters in a row, 8 over the last 9 quarters. People in Alabama are now richer on a per capita GDP basis than Canada. So, I mean, you can think about where this is headed. Our people are suffering. Our economy is shrinking. And the Americans are doing far better than we are right now. When it comes to housing, Canada currently ranks last in the G7 for housing availability per 1,000 people. The situation is really bad. We have the sharpest decline in GDP per capita in 40 years. So I'm not surprised Canadians are desperate for answers and solutions. I'm not surprised this issue comes up, but it's something that I think we should not really laugh about as Canadians.
Well, it looks like opinion polls suggest that Pierre Poilievre will win the election. Can you just give us a bit of an idea of when that election might happen? What the opinion polls are saying, what people are expecting?
So that has to happen, and by October of next year, the latest date it could happen, but really it could happen sooner. Some Canadian journalists, some mainstream Canadian journalists are predicting within 6 months. And that's because there's no way back for Justin Trudeau at this point. His polling and his deficit right now to the Conservatives in the polls is the largest in history. It's never been accomplished in Canada for an incumbent government to make up this amount of ground. So it could be as late as October 2025, but it could be sooner as well. And the result is pretty much already guaranteed that Justin Trudeau will be out, and it just depends on whether or not Pierre Poilievre will win a majority government or a minority government. But right now, it's looking like it'll be a serious majority government.
And is there any chance that Trudeau isn't the Liberal candidate? Could it be someone like Mark Carney?
It could be. There's a lot of people within the Liberal Party and within the mainstream media that are predicting this. Justin Trudeau has had to deal with an internal caucus revolt. It appears as though he's survived that caucus revolt, but there are Liberal MPs who are looking at this situation and saying, there's no way this guy can lead us forward. There's just no way this is going to work out. The problem with Mark Carney is that Carney will need to get himself elected into a safe seat and then take over, all within a very kind of quick time frame. So Mark Carney is likely going to be the next Liberal leader, but I don't predict that Trudeau will not be on the ballot. I think Trudeau will try to carry the Liberals forward, probably because of his own ego, and just hope that he can somehow, lessen the damage. There is a possibility that if another Liberal leader were to take over, the result could be even worse for the Liberals, similar to what we saw in the United States. That even though Joe Biden was almost certainly going to lose, it could have been, even better or maybe worse. But the Liberals have no bench here. There really isn't anyone within the Liberal caucus who it looks like could do better than Justin Trudeau.
Let's take it back to immigration. This issue in Canada goes back a long way, the same in Britain. I don't know too much about the immigration history in Canada, but I know that in Britain after the Second World War, we started to import lots of people from the Empire, allegedly to try and rebuild the country and so on. But it was fairly small numbers and it was fairly sustainable. Something that's similar happened in Canada, right? I mean, was it under Pierre Trudeau where they started to increase the numbers? So can you just talk a bit about the history of Canadian immigration?
For sure. So under Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, the Canadian government passed official multiculturalism, basically making multiculturalism a policy of Canada's growth and population going forward. And since around, ever since up until around, I would say, the late 1990s, Canada has prioritized European immigration, prioritized French immigration, and British immigration, with sort of a smaller number of Southeast Asian immigration. But around the mid-1990s and the late 1990s, those numbers completely changed, and we began prioritizing in large numbers Chinese immigration and Indian immigration. And since around the mid-2000s, our numbers have been very, very high. Our immigration rate has been extremely high. It wasn't turbocharged like it was post-2015, but Canada, for the majority of its history, has always prioritized European immigration. That changed when we became an official multicultural country, and even more so when Justin Trudeau came to power, because what many don't know is that one of Justin Trudeau's principles for Canada is that he wanted Canada to become the world's first post-national state with no core identity and no core values. And he achieved that in a way by speeding up the immigration from India and China and the Philippines, and really considerably lowering the amount of immigration we take from Europe.
Can you tell us about Canadian demographics? I know that in my mind, when I was growing up, I always thought of Canada as a very European nation, ex-British colony. I never thought of it as being Indian dominated, Chinese dominated. But when I went to Canada the first time a couple of years ago, it was just extraordinary walking around Toronto. It was like I was in New Delhi.
Right. Well, in Toronto and our big cities, but in particular in Toronto, white people are the minority. The majority of people are non-white, if you know what I'm trying to say here. So that is significantly different than what it has been for a long time, obviously. And we have in this country, as you do in the UK, and as there are cities in the United States like this, we have cities that are entirely dominated by one ethnic group, becoming full ethnic enclaves, such as Brampton when it comes to the Indian population, pushing 60, 70, even higher percent of that entire city is Indian. And then we have a city called Markham, just outside of Toronto, which is even more Chinese than Brampton is Indian. And these cities exist all throughout Canada, and particularly surrounding our large cities. And, like most places, when you get into the rural areas of Canada, you're very much getting the Anglophile population, the French population of Canada, but our major cities are very ethnically diverse, and that has changed Canadian culture considerably. And this all really came about after Canada decided to embrace multiculturalism as an official policy in our country. Unlike the United States with their, quote, melting pot, we have the cultural mosaic. That was the idea that our leaders wanted to try to preserve. And what that means, as you can imagine, is that we encourage people who come from other parts of the world to bring their own culture here, to not assimilate, but to try to, turn their culture into part of Canadian culture. And what happens? Well, you lose core Canadian identity and core Canadian culture, and it becomes really an amalgamation of the world's culture.
Can you assess the impact that that's had on Canada and Canadian society? Do you feel that there's been a kind of a break in social cohesion and, as you say, the erosion of Canadian culture?
Well, absolutely. And really, this came about more so recently, since 2015. I can tell you, growing up, when I was growing up in Canada, there was never any concern about the demographics of our country. Everybody knew what it meant to be Canadian. There was still a strong Canadian identity. But since Justin Trudeau came along and the post-national state idea became more official in this country, we have seen a complete breakdown in social cohesion across our country. People are very skeptical of immigrants into this country. In fact, many new immigrants want to restrict immigration because the country they came to is not the country they expected to come to. They're seeing their own cultures from back home play out here in Canada. So part of the reason why immigration numbers are now drastically changing just over the past few weeks is because we've had a complete breakdown in our social cohesion. Many Canadians don't know what it means to be Canadian. We do not try to reinforce a Canadian identity or a Canadian value, and it's had real impact on us. And another thing that's happening is that these incoming immigrant groups are fighting amongst themselves. They're not dropping their foreign issues. They're not parking them at the door. They're actually bringing them here and fighting in our streets to try to, advance their own social and religious and sectarian battles in our streets, resulting in really Canada looking at the situation and saying, well, maybe we don't want any of this here, and we're going to considerably lower our numbers. And so, yeah, it's had significant impact and really not something that I think any Canadian wants to see.
As you say, there's been a big backlash against immigration in Canada, so much so that Trudeau himself is saying that he's going to restrict immigration. What's going on there? Why has Trudeau reversed? Has he truly reversed? Does he really believe in border controls?
Well, whether or not he truly believes it is one thing, and it would be dangerous to try to predict what he's thinking in his head. We've tried that before and it's failed. But immigration in Canada is now basically the single largest issue in this country. The overwhelming majority of Canadians across the political divide are in favor of reducing immigration. And they were in favor of reducing immigration last year. It's just that nobody was listening to them, not even the opposition. But since Donald Trump was elected, and even when it became quite obvious that Trump was going to be elected, the tune started to change from the government. And the numbers that they've proposed are remarkable. And I want to read them out to you. So last year, the immigration minister said that this country was going to accept close to 500,000 permanent residents for 2024 and 500,000 for 2025 and 500,000 for 2026, the highest numbers we've ever seen. He has now changed those numbers to be 395,000 for 2025 and 380 for 2026 and 365 for 2027. So the numbers have completely changed. Trudeau tells us that he's going to try to pause population growth for the next 3 years. I don't exactly know how you're going to pause population growth by bringing in close to 400,000 permanent residents, but that is what he says. He's essentially, in that video that has gone viral, advocating for net zero immigration. That's not exactly going to happen, quite clearly, but the numbers have completely changed. And the reason for this is because the Conservative opposition have finally found their voice, and they've been willing to push back just a little bit on Justin Trudeau. But it is now very popular in Canada to try to sound strong on immigration, to try to control the border, and to try to control the situation. Whether or not it actually happens, I can't really predict.
I want to ask a bit more about the erosion of Canadian identity and culture, the purposeful erosion of that culture by elites. I know that there's been some controversies over things like, for example, changing the flag to the maple leaf, changing the currency to remove Canadian victories at places like Vimy Ridge and replacing it with images of squirrels and things. What's going on there? Are they essentially ashamed of Canadian Canadian history? Do they link that? Is it the same thing? I mean, in Britain, for example, they say, you know, we were part, obviously we had the empire, so therefore we have to be incredibly ashamed of that. Can you just delve into a bit of how elites treat Canadian history?
Right. They don't care about our history. They have allowed for radical left-wing activists, the Antifa types, to take over this situation, topple our statues without any punishment, and they've also, through the bureaucracy, hastened this along as well. You mentioned the erasing Vimy Ridge and erasing some of our great Canadian icons from our passport and replacing them with this corporate Memphis-style image of squirrels and swans and lakes. That was deeply controversial in our country. There's absolutely no reason for us to try to erase images of our great victories and our great Canadian heroes, but they've done that. Even more so, they took John A. Macdonald, the founder of our country, the father of Confederation, off the $10 bill and replaced him with a woman named Viola Desmond, who essentially is a Canadian version of Rosa Parks. For really no reason at all. To remove the founder of our country from the currency is absurd, but they've done that. And I'll talk a bit more about John A. Macdonald, the founder of our country, someone who we should be celebrating and honoring in every way possible. The federal government reopened his house as a museum, and they decided to turn his house into a shrine for Indigenous people and a way to mock and ridicule Macdonald's legacy. Furthermore, the government tried to erase positive videos of John A. Macdonald, positive reenactments of John A. Macdonald's creation of our country from YouTube, saying that it was insensitive to Indigenous people. I don't know exactly why they're doing this to our country, but they are doing it. It is systemic, and it impacts all of our great Canadian heroes. Our statues are being toppled all over the country. Macdonald's statues have been toppled. In fact, at our provincial legislature, a statue of Macdonald has been inside of a wooden box, a very visible wooden box, for 3 years. It's just been in a wooden box in the middle of our city for 3 years. And it's unbelievable. This has an impact on Canadian people, whether or not the government wants to acknowledge it or not. It has an impact, and it is damaging our identity.
And what about the Canadian Conservative Party and your version of the kind of populist movement there? I know there's Maxime Bernier. Can you discuss Pierre Poilievre? I know that he's faced some criticism, his Conservative Party has in the past, for being really soft on lots of issues like the trans issues, even immigration. Can you just break down, I know maybe you know a bit about the British Tories and how they've been pretty weak over the last 14 years. What's going on in Canada? What's going on with the Canadian Conservatives?
Well, the Canadian Conservative Party is a very centrist party, and they have been extremely soft on immigration, on social issues like the transgender issue, and on our cultural issues as well. They have been governed by public polling data, by a group of political strategists that are insulated from the general public of our country, who live in the Ottawa bubble and are not paying attention to the issues that are really impacting the Canadian people. So that has resulted in the party, at one point, in fact, advocating against deportations, saying that the Liberal Party is too harsh on immigration, just 2 years ago, by the way, and saying that the Conservatives will have faster immigration into this country. Right, just 2 years ago. So when we were having the massive open border surge, the Conservatives were cheering it on. Right now, what we're seeing is the Conservative Party is waking up to the reality that the majority of Canadians want a restriction on immigration. They want to see a more conservative party. And when it comes to our populist party, I would consider it to be the equivalent of reform here in Canada, but far less successful. That party has no real chance of any electoral success. There's no real chance of them winning a single seat in Parliament. And so people are looking at that situation and saying, is it worth my time to support the party that has absolutely no chance of governing this country? Or is it worth trying to push the Conservative Party to be far more conservative? And the party right now, Pierre Poilievre's Conservative Party, which is almost certainly going to win, needs to be more conservative. They are very afraid, Stephen, of being called racist. They're very afraid of being described as anti-immigrant. And so they're doing whatever they can to simply just glide into office, not ruffle any feathers, and hope that nobody calls them out for daring to actually be conservative. it's not going to work for them, I'm afraid. They need to show some backbone. They need to be serious. And we'll see what happens with that. But right now, they've shown really no willingness to be truly conservative.
What about the French part of Canada, the part of Quebec? Are they more socially conservative? Which party do they support?
Well, they are supporting a group called the Bloc Québécois, a separatist party. And this separatist party actually has a lot of influence in our country because of the amount of seats Quebec has. So there is a party that only cares about one province, only tries to advocate for more distance from Ottawa for Quebec, and they could end up being the official opposition or the third largest party in our parliament as they are right now. And on a provincial basis, on a provincial level, yes, they are more socially conservative, but they're more anti-immigration because they're concerned about protecting French language, which is drastically reducing in Quebec. But they also are just frankly concerned mostly about distancing themselves from Ottawa and having more distance and being more separatist. So that's the issue with Quebec right now. They are more socially conservative. But it's purely on reasons just to try to preserve their French heritage within Canada.
Thank you for watching this video. If you want to watch more content, please subscribe to our new GBN America YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.